Good morning. This is your sermon for Sunday, November the 1st. This week we're going to be learning about a beautiful woman named Abigail from 1 Samuel chapter 25, and what we can learn about from her life, from the experiences that she had, from some of the decisions that she made, and what we can learn from about being a Christian today as we walk before God. Next week we'll be looking at another man of faith, and his name is David. And specifically, we'd just have to pick one incident in his life. So if you want to read ahead for next week, that would be 1 Samuel chapter 17. And it has to do with slaying a giant. So this week we look in 1 Samuel chapter 25, looking at a beautiful woman named Abigail. Just a little bit of background to the story. David has been anointed king by the prophet Samuel, and Samuel has been the prophet and the judge of Israel, and he is going to be the last judge of Israel as he anoints Saul the king over all of Israel. Now, what has been happening during this time is Saul has disobeyed God, has fallen out of favor with God, and Samuel, at the Lord's instruction, has anointed David to be the next king. And yet Saul is still reigning, so there is some time before David is going to be king. David doesn't know when that is going to be. Saul finds out about this, and he has been chasing David all over the place, trying to kill him. He has men that are his mighty men of war that are with him, chasing David's mighty men of war, when really they should be on the same team. Saul is trying to kill David. That kind of sets the tone for what happens in this story. Because as Saul has been chasing David, David gets a little bit of a reprieve, a little bit of time of peace, I guess you would say, of Saul not chasing him. But David and his men spend some time in this place called Carmel. And yes, that is a very yummy sounding place to me. But where they stay, they protect the young men that are shearing the sheep there. And all of these sheep belong to a very rich man named Nabal. And David and his men form a wall around these men so that they can do their job and that they can do it safely. And that's what men of war do. They protect people. They fight. And so they make sure that no invaders from the other surrounding countries attack Nabal's men. Well, a while later, it's time for Israel to have a feast. And they have feasts every once in a while that they really celebrate together as a nation. And we're not told which feast this is. But what we see is there is some expectation that everybody is to have a feast before the Lord. And so, as it is time to get ready for this feast, David sends some of his men over to Nabal's house. And he asks Nabal to provide for his men as David's men have provided for Nabal. It's a reasonable request that David gives, and it's an opportunity for Nabal to pay back to David a good thing that David has already done for him. So to repay good for good, as you might say. But Nabal is a very surly and harsh man. He's really not a nice guy to deal with at all. And as David's servants come and ask him for this food, for this feast, or that if they can join them, Nabal wonders out loud, not very nicely, who this David might be, even making him mocking him a bit. Mocking him in a way that is very unkind. And Nabal decides, nope, I'm not going to share anything with you. So David is told, as his servants come back, the message that Nabal gives to the servants, and David is mad. He is so mad, he's like, that's it. We are going to deal with this right now. And he tells his men, strap on your swords. We're going to go fight this guy. We're going to deal with this miserable guy. So while David is still getting angry, one of Nabal's servants goes and tells Abigail, the woman of our story here, who just happens to be Nabal's wife. And so the servant tells Abigail what has happened and that doom is going to come to all of them. And she quickly makes a decision, takes a generous amount of food, and goes to find David and his men and to avert this disaster that will surely come on the house of Nabal. So she meets with David and she convinces him, gives him the food. She convinces him not to go and to attack Nabal. And now they have food for the feast. David and his men are provided for, and disaster is temporarily averted. Nabal doesn't know what is going on. He holds a feast that ironically is fit for a king. And he has so much, he even gets drunk. And what we see here is that Abigail notices the situation, and instead of telling him what has happened when he is drunk, she waits until he is sober the next day, and she tells him what she has done in taking David this food. And from that point on, Nabal never recovers. It says his heart becomes like a stone, and 10 days later, God strikes Nabal, and 10 days later, Nabal dies. And after this, David sends word and takes this beautiful woman, this beautiful, intelligent, wise woman of faith, as his wife. And we're going to talk a little bit about these two characters and really look at what is pleasing to God and what is displeasing to God. We see Nabal, a man of folly, and we see Abigail, a woman of faith. Nabal we'll look at first, and this is just to give a contrast in what we see, how they are the same and how they are different. First of all, Nabal is a very harsh man. He is willingly ignorant. He's pretending that he doesn't even know David and his men. While David was with them, none of their men took anything from Nabal, didn't even ask for anything in return. At this time, Israel was used to having raiding parties come from some of the neighboring nations and exacting what they would see as attacks or just taking what they pleased sometimes. So to have that protection was something that was very valuable to Nabal. But he was harsh with David. He's ungrateful even. He even says to David, "Many servants are breaking away from their masters today. Who are you?" You know, he's talking about David like he's a lowlife, like he is not a good person. David's been running away from Saul. And so maybe Nabal is kind of using this in a way of, look at this, you're just running away from somebody else. I mean, what kind of a person must you be to have to live this kind of a life? David wasn't king yet, but he would be in time. David needed the food to survive and to celebrate this feast together with his men. Nabal was a very badly behaved man. He was very rich by the standards of that time. David was not yet rich. Well, he was, but he left it all behind and runs for his life. But Nabal looks down on David. Who is David? Who is this guy? Who is the son of Jesse? Who is he compared to me? Basically, is the attitude that he takes. He doesn't see anything special about David. And he even says, basically, I don't really know this guy. I don't know why I should give him any of my bread that I had prepared for the shearers of my sheep. Why should I give that to somebody that I don't even know? Nabal takes the attitude of every man for himself. I earned it. It's mine. It belongs to me. I can do with it as I please. And I'm not giving it to somebody that I don't know or who doesn't deserve it. He was a foolish man. He made very bad decisions in looking out only for himself and only for his wealth. And in this story, we see him, even after he refuses David, he goes and feasts like a king, indulging to the extreme, even where he is drunk on wine. He wouldn't even give up anything that would have been at his table for David and his men, even when they had showed him kindness. Jewish feasts were to celebrate together as a nation. It was their identity in God that they celebrated together. And David and his men are going to be left out while Nabal and his servants feast like a king. That is Nabal, a very foolish man. Abigail is not like him at all. She's married to him. She belongs to the same household as him. And you would think that they would make decisions together. But in this case, Nabal makes a very foolish decision, and his wife decides to do something that is wise instead of foolish. The first thing that I note about Abigail is that she's a woman of decision. She's not one to take her time doing something when she sees a disaster coming. She's not afraid of just stepping in and doing something. She doesn't spare any time when she knows that disaster is coming. She's going to get up and she's going to do something about it right away. She could have easily just agreed with her husband, said, oh, well, you know what is best. Or she could have just chose to do nothing. Or she could have chose to run away. She could have chose to do many other things, but she doesn't do any of those. She decides to do something about the situation. And the thing that she chooses to do is much more difficult. Instead of doing nothing, she chooses to take the more difficult route. She goes to David and she takes responsibility for what Nabal has done. Now, she is a part of his household, and so it is in her right to be able to do this, but she takes responsibility for this, even though she was not part of that decision, and she asks David for forgiveness and asks him to spare Nabal and her. But she does it in a way that is not self-seeking or just all about protecting herself. She really does it in wisdom. So we see that she's a woman of decision. She's also a woman of wisdom. She's not just a pretty face, although it does describe her as a very beautiful woman. She's very smart. And she decides to stop this foolishness to prevent the disaster that is going to come. I wonder if she didn't see men being foolish, running around, being mean to each other, and going to war with each other and saying, enough, what are you guys doing? Stop doing this. In her wisdom, she gives very generously to David and his men. She's very kind in taking this to them. Even though her husband has said no, she has decided against that and gone and provided for them anyways. And she does it in wisdom, not to get something for herself, but she knows what the right thing is to do. And she speaks kindly with David, one who is going to visit disaster on her and her household, not leave any males alive in all of the household. And she speaks kindly with him, and she asks for his favor. And Abigail really is a woman of faith. She's got to have some idea that as she goes into this situation with David, and that this plan that she has of taking him this food and asking him to turn away from this, she's a woman of faith. She knows that David is fighting the Lord's battles. She knows the kind of person that David is. And she chooses to follow after one who is a servant of the Lord. She gives David honor and places her trust in the one who is doing the Lord's will. Her husband sure doesn't act like it at this time. So Abigail puts faith in those who are serving the Lord. Also, this faith that she has is that David is going to be king. It seems to be known by both Nabal and Abigail, and probably most of Israel, what is happening with Saul, that he has been rejected by the Lord, and that David has been anointed king. It seems to be common knowledge. At least she has known this. And she has faith that God is going to bring to pass that which he has said about his servant David. She trusts that God will carry through on his promises, and sees that Nabal is going to be standing in the way of that. Her plan, as she goes to David, is to avert the disaster, to avoid it, to make sure that that disaster does not happen. So she had to have some faith that her plan would work, and that plan was all based on the fact that God will take care of her. Really, what we see in this story is two people living in the same household, one who is very foolish and one who is very wise. Nabal is the fool and Abigail is of faith. The way of a fool is treating others with disdain, even being harsh with them because you're the one who has the power and the control. But the way of faith is realizing that it's better to be humble and honor God's servant, because God is the one who has all of the power and all of the control. It's just an illusion to think that we have it. The way of a fool is looking down on others, while the way of faith is building others up. The way of a fool is every man for himself, while the way of faith helps others, and especially those who are in need. It is so easy in this life of richness that we have in our country, for us to forget that God is working in his kingdom and bringing about the salvation of our souls. It is easy to get distracted with the cares of this world and to forget the work that God is doing in his kingdom. Well, how much do you value being a man or woman of faith? Or do we get so caught up in the things of this world that we accidentally choose a life of folly? When we read through the book of Proverbs, it's all about either being a person of folly or a person of wisdom. We have the choice to make. And I think we learn from the story of Abigail, one who is of the same household of Nabal, does not have to participate in the foolishness of this world. God has given us instruction, and he asks us to take a stand, to live for him, to live a life of faith. We can live a life of faith and wisdom. And I know sometimes we doubt our own ability to do that. But God tells us in the book of James that if we lack wisdom, we should ask, because God gives generously to those who ask, to all who ask. So this week, as we are going along in our life, my challenge for you this morning and for today and for this week is to try to live a life of wisdom and to know the difference between wisdom and folly. And if you want to get a good start on this, I definitely would suggest reading the book of Proverbs. Abigail is an excellent example of a woman of faith who makes a difference to her whole household and to everyone around her because she chooses the way of faith. I hope that she is an example to you and that you also may choose the way of faith.